Good morning and welcome to the next in our series of reflections from John's Gospel. Today we're going to think a little bit about Peter's denial of Jesus during the period in the immediate run-up to the crucifixion, and we're going to hear some verses from John's Gospel, chapter 18, beginning at verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. Then the servant who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." Now the servants and the officers who made the fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. As Simon Peter warmed himself, they said to him, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it again and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the one whose ear Peter had cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So we find ourselves today in this reading in the run-up to the events of the crucifixion. Jesus had previously shared the Last Supper with his friends and disciples, and there he foretold his own betrayal by Judas. He'd instructed the disciples of many things which were to come, and how he would soon be leaving them, and how they should continue to love each other. And he prayed with them and for them. During this period at the Last Supper, Jesus had also told Peter that he himself would deny Jesus. Peter had denied that this could ever happen. He loved the Lord, he'd always be there for him. And so we arrive at this episode today. Finally, as Jesus had prayed in the garden, he'd been betrayed by Judas as he'd foretold. He'd been arrested and taken to face the authorities. So we find Jesus taken to the house of the high priest. Peter and another disciple waited outside in the courtyard, warming themselves by the fire. We can only begin to imagine quite how they felt, Peter and his friends. They'd given up everything to follow Jesus after all. They'd sacrificed jobs, family, money, security. They'd spent their time alongside Jesus, serving him, working with him, walking with him, listening as he taught the crowds, listening as he taught them in private, enjoyed intimate meals. They'd witnessed his miracles, how he'd healed the sick, raised the dead, even calmed the wind and the waves in the mighty storm. They'd listened time and time again as Jesus, the mighty orator, had taught and commanded respect amongst the least and the greatest. They knew more of Jesus than anyone else. They trusted him more than anyone else. And suddenly it was all unraveling right before their eyes. I'm sure this wasn't how they'd expected that amazing journey to end. So here they stood in the darkness, Jesus taking away. Armed men threatening them, their security, their safety, their very lives. Perhaps it's not surprising that Peter responded as he did. After all, wouldn't we? Peter had absolutely no idea what was going to happen next. He was probably still trying to understand all that Jesus had told them about what was to come, about leaving them, about how they should live in the future. I think it is to Peter's credit and that of the other disciple that they didn't run away. When they were threatened, they followed with Jesus. They didn't stand at a distance and watch. They went as far as they could to keep him company, right up to the door of the house of the high priest Annas. In such a situation, you and I might have turned and run, hidden away, denied ever knowing this man. But they arrived in a courtyard with a fire burning, Imagine, if you can, the darkness, the chilly night air, the sense of hostility and unease in the air around them, the uncertainty of what tomorrow or even tonight would bring. Peter wanted to be near his friend, his leader, but then he was challenged by a servant girl. "You aren't also one of his disciples, are you?" she said. And his response was a very clear denial. "I am not." As he stood close by the fire warming himself, members of the high priest's staff also challenged him. "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" And again the denial. "I am not." Peter was very clearly denying Jesus, just as Jesus had foretold. Finally, Peter encountered a relative of the man whose ear he'd cut off in the garden when Jesus was being arrested. This man knew that he'd seen Peter there, so he challenged him again. "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And again, Peter denied knowing the Lord. And at that, the cockerel crowed. And Peter knew that he had done exactly what Jesus had foretold. He must have felt absolutely wretched, absolutely awful. He denied his closest friend and ally, his leader, his teacher, the man he loved, the man who'd promised so much, who'd showed him a different way of living. He'd learned so much about God's love, what God wanted for him and the rest of the world. He'd heard Jesus say, "Love one another as I have loved you." And in that love, he denied Jesus. I truly believe, though, that in Peter's position, many of us would have responded in exactly the same way, if we'd even had the courage to get as far as the courtyard. Well, we could just leave the story there, I suppose. An episode in history, an episode in his story. But do we have the emotional courage to think what it might mean for us, to ponder on whether you and I ever deny Jesus as Peter did? In conclusion, I'd like to share with you just a short reflection that I wrote one year when the family were having a holiday shortly after Easter on a farm. I woke early as the rest of the family slept and went for a walk in the farmyard and up the lane nearby. And I wrote this. It's called At Dawn. Slowly the sun rises. The enormous golden orb straddles the sky, steely grey, fading into the palest blue. Nearby, in the trees, the birds are calling, voices combining into the urgency of an approaching day. Flashes of yellow and black as hedgerow birds feed on hanging seeds. Nearby in the fields, the cow's breath produces clouds of vapour as they softly chomp the grass. Absolute peace and such serenity. Standing here, God feels very near. And in the distance, a cockerel crows. And before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times, said the Lord to Peter. And the self-satisfied core of being responds, I'll never deny you, Lord. And yet, each time I fail to acknowledge your authority in the decisions of my life, I deny you, Lord. Slowly the sun rises a little higher. The warmth begins to grow. And a crowing cockerel is clearly heard echoing through the quietness of that dawn. And each time I fail to love others as I love myself, I deny you, Lord. Now the sky is bright. The sun is risen, warming the early morning air. And a third time, a cockerel crowing shatters the complacent peace of the sleeping world. And each time I choose to pursue earthly pleasure rather than spending time with you, Lord, rather than choosing to be in your presence in worship and in prayer. I deny you again. Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. So said the Lord.